The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl into an orchard hut where a marked map led straight to a dead man's secret. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's incredible story. It was a cold and windy evening when the Hells Angels biker, known as Jake, pulled his Harley-Davidson to a slow stop at the edge of a dense orchard. The wind howled around him as he glanced at the map clutched in his gloved hands. The faded ink on the paper pointed to a small orchard hut, tucked away among the trees. Jake had no idea what he was getting himself into, but something about this map, and the strange little girl who handed it to him, kept his mind spinning. The girl had appeared out of nowhere, almost as if she was sent by fate. She was small, no older than 12, with dark eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. She had asked him, in a soft voice, to help her find the hut in the orchard, where a secret was buried, hidden by her family for generations. "The map will lead you there," she had said. "But be careful, there are things that should remain lost." Jake didn't believe in fate, but the way the girl looked at him had made him feel an unexplainable pull. He folded the map carefully and shoved it into his jacket pocket. The air was thick with mystery, the only sound being the crunch of his boots on the snow-covered ground as he made his way toward the hut. The night sky above was dark, with only the light from his bike's headlamp cutting through the blackness. He reached the hut, its silhouette barely visible in the distance. The door creaked loudly as Jake pushed it open. Inside, the smell of old wood and dust filled the air. The small, dimly lit space was cluttered with forgotten relics, each one seemingly holding a story of its own. Jake's heart raced as he looked around, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. In the corner of the room, a large, old chest caught his eye. The lid was slightly ajar, as if it had been opened recently. He moved toward it cautiously, the silence of the room amplifying every step he took. As Jake knelt down to open the chest fully, a strange chill ran down his spine. He could feel it. This was no ordinary chest. It was something far more significant. When he opened the lid, his eyes widened in disbelief. Inside, nestled among layers of old cloth, was a collection of papers, photographs, and a small, weathered box. The box had a symbol on it, a symbol Jake recognized from his past, a symbol tied to a dangerous family, one he had crossed paths with many years ago. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The secret the girl spoke of was not just a family history, but something much darker, something that had been buried to protect the living from its consequences. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for the box. He had no idea what he had just uncovered, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning of a much bigger story, a story that was about to unravel in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. I have already found the box and opened it, but as Jake lifted it from the chest, his hands felt cold. The weight of it in his palms seemed to carry more than just its physical mass. As the box creaked open, he glanced at the small girl, who stood behind him, watching him intently, her eyes wide with something between fear and anticipation. She hadn't said much since they arrived at the orchard hut, but her silence felt louder than any words she could have spoken. She was no longer the innocent child she appeared to be when they first met. There was a depth to her gaze now, something that sent a chill down Jake's spine. Inside the box, Jake found a collection of old photographs and papers, all worn and yellowed by time. Each document seemed to tell a part of a story, one that Jake realized was far bigger than he had ever imagined. One photograph stood out among the rest. It was an image of a group of people, their faces partially obscured by shadows. But one figure in the middle stood out clearly, a man with sharp features and a tattoo on his arm that Jake recognized immediately. The man was someone from his past, someone who had once been a part of a dangerous underground world, someone who had disappeared years ago, leaving only rumors behind. Jake's heart raced. He couldn't believe it. He had never expected this box to be connected to his past, to a chapter he had buried long ago. The girl's soft voice broke his thoughts. "That's my grandfather," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's the one who hid everything." Jake turned to her, his mind racing. Your grandfather? He repeated, struggling to process what she had just said. But he's the one who disappeared. The one people said was dead. The girl nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. He wasn't dead. He just disappeared. He had everything before he left. My family, they were trying to find him for years, but they never could. Jake didn't know what to say. He had crossed paths with people like her grandfather before, and none of them ever left behind something as simple as a map. These were dangerous people who buried their secrets deep, knowing full well that anyone who sought them out would pay the price. But here was this girl, standing in front of him, carrying the weight of her family's legacy. She didn't fully understand it, but Jake did. This wasn't just about hidden treasure, it was about survival. Jake's eyes flicked back to the photograph in his hand. The man in the picture, her grandfather, was staring directly at the camera, his eyes cold and calculating. Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. The feeling of something being off deepened with each passing second. This isn't just a map to a treasure, Jake muttered, more to himself than to the girl. It's a map to a past that no one wanted uncovered. The girl stepped closer, her eyes locked on the photo as well. What does it mean? She asked softly. Jake looked at her, the weight of the responsibility hitting him harder than he expected. It means we've opened a door that should have stayed closed, he said, his voice grave. Your grandfather wasn't just hiding money or valuables. He was hiding something much darker, something that could cost us both our lives. The wind outside howled louder, shaking the hut, as if the very air was warning them to leave the past buried. But it was too late now. The truth had already been set in motion. Jake closed the box, the reality of what they had uncovered sinking in. He had to keep her safe. But from what? And more importantly, who else knew about this box? Just then, Jake heard the sound of footsteps outside the hut. The girl's face paled, and she took a step back. Jake's instincts kicked in. Someone was coming. They weren't alone anymore. He stood up quickly, glancing at the girl. We need to leave. Now. She nodded, fear flashing in her eyes. But Jake could see the determination there, too. The door creaked open just as they turned toward it. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway. The man wore a dark jacket and a cap that obscured most of his face, but Jake could make out the distinct tattoos on his arms. They were the same tattoos Jake had seen on the photograph, symbols that tied this man to the past Jake had tried to escape. The man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. I know you have it, he said, his voice low and dangerous. And I'm not leaving without it. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know if this man was friend or foe, but one thing was certain. He had just stepped into a game that was far bigger than he ever imagined. The secrets of the past were about to collide with the present, and Jake wasn't sure if they would survive the storm. I will not leave without it. The words echoed in Jake's mind as the man in the doorway took another step forward, his eyes locked onto the box. The girl, still standing behind Jake, barely moved, her breath shallow as she tried to hide behind him. She knew just as well as Jake that this man meant trouble. Her grandfather's secrets were about to drag them both into something much darker than they had ever anticipated. Jake didn't hesitate. His instincts screamed at him to protect the girl. He moved between her and the stranger, his hand instinctively gripping the handle of his knife, though he didn't pull it out. Yet, the man's eyes flicked to Jake's hand, but he didn't flinch. He seemed too confident, as if he was used to getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. I know you know what's inside that box, the man said, his voice a low growl. It's not just some forgotten trinket. It's worth more than you can imagine. Jake's eyes narrowed, his mind racing as he tried to process the situation. The man wasn't just after a piece of family history. He was after something much more valuable. Jake had been through enough fights to recognize desperation when he saw it. And this man was desperate. But desperate men were dangerous. What do you want with it? Jake asked, keeping his voice calm despite the tension building in his chest. The man smirked. I want what's mine. The map, the documents, everything your little friend's grandfather hid. I've been looking for it for years. Jake's mind raced. The secrets hidden in the box weren't just some family heirlooms. They were tied to something far bigger. The mention of the map sent a chill down his spine. And what makes you think I'm just going to hand it over? Jake said, his voice hardening. The man took another step forward, his posture unthreatening, but his words cutting like a knife. Because if you don't, I'll make sure you both disappear, just like the others. Jake stiffened, his hand tightening on his knife's hilt. This man wasn't playing around, and neither was Jake. The girl behind him trembled, but Jake could feel her resolve. She wasn't about to let her grandfather's legacy be destroyed by some stranger. He glanced at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. This wasn't just about the box anymore. It was about protecting her future. "You don't know who you're messing with," Jake said through gritted teeth. The man's smirk faded, replaced with a cold, calculating stare. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a gun, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "And you don't know who you're dealing with," the man retorted. "I've got men watching your every move. If you don't hand over the box, things are going to get ugly." Jake knew that if he didn't act fast, they were as good as dead. Without thinking, he lunged forward, grabbing the man's arm before he could raise the gun. There was a struggle, the two men colliding in a tangle of limbs, but Jake's strength and experience gave him the upper hand. He wrestled the man to the ground, disarming him in a fluid motion, the gun skidding across the floor. For a moment, everything went silent. Jake stood over the man, breathing heavily, while the girl watched with wide eyes, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. The man on the floor glared up at Jake, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You think this is over?" he spat. "This is just the beginning. You can't hide from me." Jake didn't respond. Instead, he pulled the man up by his shirt, dragging him toward the door. "Get out," Jake growled. The man didn't move at first, but after a few moments, he pushed past Jake, stumbling out of the hut into the night. Jake slammed the door behind him, locking it tightly. He turned to the girl, his heart pounding in his chest. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. The girl nodded, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. "He'll be back," she said quietly. "I know he will." Jake rubbed his hand over his face, frustration building inside him. "We don't have time for this. We need to get out of here before more of his people show up." He grabbed the box and tucked it securely under his arm. "We're going to finish this. We'll find out what your grandfather was hiding, and we'll make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." The girl nodded again, her resolve strengthening. They had to keep moving. There was no turning back now. The weight of the box was heavier than ever, and Jake knew the journey ahead would only get more dangerous. The man was just the first obstacle in their path, but Jake wasn't going to let anyone, or anything, stand in their way. They had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The storm outside had not yet let up, and the wind howled through the trees, as if nature itself was warning them of the danger ahead. Jake's grip tightened on the box as he turned to the girl. "Let's go. We don't have much time." They stepped out of the hut, their footsteps crunching in the snow as they made their way toward an uncertain future. They had the map, they had the box, but the real question was, what would they find when they uncovered the secrets buried in the past? "I know what's in that box, and it's not just history. It's a time bomb waiting to explode." Jake's voice was cold, and the air between him and the girl was thick with tension. They had escaped the man, but Jake knew this wasn't over. The real challenge was only just beginning. The girl stood beside him, her small frame shivering from more than just the cold. She looked at him, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. "What does it mean?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the silence. Jake took a deep breath and shook his head. He didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't lie either. "It means your grandfather was involved in something dangerous, something that goes far beyond his family." He paused for a moment, glancing at the box that lay heavy in his hands. "And it means there are people out there who will stop at nothing to get their hands on it." They were standing in the middle of a secluded road, the wind howling through the trees and the snow continuing to fall. The world felt eerily silent, as if everything around them was holding its breath. Jake knew they had to move, but he also knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. He turned to the girl, trying to keep his tone calm. "We need to find out more about your grandfather and the people he was involved with. We can't just run blindly. We need answers." The girl nodded, but her expression remained fearful. "How do we even start? Who do we trust?" Jake paused, thinking for a moment. He'd been in situations like this before, but this was different. This time, it wasn't just his life on the line. The girl had been dragged into a world of secrets, a world she had no idea about. He had to protect her, but he also needed to make sure they had a plan. "I know someone who might be able to help," he said, his voice steady. "An old contact of mine. A guy who's been in this world long enough to know who's who." The girl looked up at him, her face a mixture of hope and doubt. "Do you think he'll help us?" Jake shrugged, not sure himself. He's not the type to turn away from a good mystery, especially when it's got something to do with the kind of people we're dealing with. He looked around, making sure no one was watching. We'll need to move quickly. If we stay in one place for too long, it'll get worse. The girl hesitated but then nodded. She seemed to understand. Jake reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the map that had led them here. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the faded lines. "This map leads to something," he murmured. "Your grandfather hid it for a reason. But whatever's on the other side, we need to be ready for it." The snow continued to fall around them, the wind picking up, but Jake could feel the pressure of time weighing on him. He had to make a decision, and fast. They had no choice but to follow the clues and hope they didn't lead straight into a trap. He folded the map back up and tucked it into his jacket. "Let's go. We don't have much time." They walked through the snow-covered road, their footsteps crunching in the silence. Every sound felt amplified in the stillness, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The girl stayed close to him, her small hand gripping the sleeve of his jacket. He could tell she was scared, but she wasn't saying anything. She didn't need to. Jake was used to dealing with fear, his own and other people's. It was part of the job. But this time, it was different. He wasn't just dealing with criminals or dangerous men. He was dealing with a child who had been pulled into a world of violence and secrets she had no idea existed. And that made him angrier than anything else. As they walked, Jake's mind raced, thinking about their next move. He could feel the weight of the box, the secret it contained, and the promise of danger that came with it. The man who had confronted them earlier wasn't the only one looking for it. Jake knew that much. Whoever had hidden it, whatever it was valuable enough to kill for. And that meant they weren't safe. Not yet. They had a long road ahead of them, and Jake wasn't sure how it would end. But one thing was clear, they couldn't stop now. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and Jake wasn't about to let anyone else get to it first. "I know we're being followed," Jake said, his voice low and serious. The girl, still close behind him, looked up at him, her eyes wide with concern. She had been silent for most of the walk, but Jake could feel the weight of her fear. He tried to reassure her with a quick glance, but the feeling in his gut was growing stronger. There was no denying it anymore. Someone was tracking them, and they needed to keep moving. "We have to make it to the city," Jake continued, his pace quickening. "We need to find my contact. He's the only one who can help us." The girl nodded, trying to keep up with his long strides, but Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She was scared, and he didn't blame her. This was a lot for her to handle, especially with everything that had already happened. The storm had picked up, snow swirling around them as they moved through the dense forest, the branches of trees hanging low under the weight of the snow. The wind was biting, and Jake could feel it cutting through his jacket, but he didn't slow down. They had no time to waste. As they walked, Jake's thoughts drifted back to the man they had encountered earlier, the one who had threatened them at the orchard hut. The man was dangerous, but Jake wasn't afraid. He had been in worse situations before, faced far more dangerous people. But this time, things were different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting the girl, and that made everything more complicated. She had become more than just a witness to the past. She was now a part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. And Jake wasn't about to let anyone hurt her. His contact was in the city, someone who owed him a favor from years ago. Someone who could get them the information they needed, who could help them understand what was going on. Jake wasn't sure what the man had to do with all of this, but he had a gut feeling that the answers they were searching for were in the city, buried under layers of lies and secrets. As they neared the edge of the forest, Jake stopped, scanning the area. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. Someone was getting closer. "Stay behind me," he said to the girl, his tone firm but not unkind. She nodded and stayed close, but Jake could tell she was nervous. The road ahead was dark, and the only light was the faint glow from the distant city. They were getting closer, but so were the people who were after them. Jake's instincts told him to stay alert. His fingers tightened around the handle of his knife, just in case. It wasn't the first time he'd had to fight his way out of a situation, but he hoped it wouldn't come to that. The city was close, but so were the dangers that lurked in the shadows. As they moved through the last stretch of forest, Jake spotted movement in the distance. Figures. Several of them. They were too far to make out clearly, but Jake knew they were coming for them. He grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her close. "We're going to have to move faster," he said, his voice urgent. She didn't protest. She understood. Jake had been in enough dangerous situations to know that the only way to survive was to keep moving, to stay one step ahead. He didn't have much time before they'd be surrounded, but he wasn't about to let that happen. They reached the edge of the forest and stepped onto the open road. The city was just ahead, a dark silhouette against the night sky. But as Jake turned to look behind them, he saw them, the men who had been following them. There were 5 of them, all wearing dark clothing and moving in perfect coordination. They had tracked them down, and now there was nowhere to run. Jake's heart raced as he quickly assessed the situation. They had to get to the city, but the men were closing in fast. He pulled the girl behind a nearby car, crouching low to avoid being seen. "We're not going to make it out of this unless we get some help," he muttered to himself. The girl clung to him, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" she whispered. Jake didn't answer right away. He was thinking, weighing his options. They were trapped, and time was running out. But then he remembered his contact again. The man in the city. Maybe he was their only chance. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "We make a run for it," he said finally. "We're going to get to that building, no matter what." He turned to face her, giving her a determined look. "Stay close to me. We don't stop for anything. Understand?" She nodded, her face pale but resolute. Jake felt a flicker of pride. She was scared, but she was tough. Together, they could make it. He was sure of it. The men were almost upon them, and there was no more time to waste. Jake's eyes locked onto the distant building where his contact was waiting. It was their only hope. "On my count," Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through his veins. 3, 2, 1. And with that, they ran. As they sprinted across the road, Jake's mind raced, calculating the best path. The men were gaining, but they had a head start. It was a gamble, but it was their only option. They couldn't afford to slow down. Jake's feet pounded against the pavement as they neared the city's outskirts. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder, and Jake's heart began to race even faster. They were close. So close. He could see the door to the building now, a few more yards ahead. But would they make it in time? "I don't think we're going to make it," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of their feet against the pavement. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't afford to. Every step was a calculated risk. They were running as fast as they could, but the sound of footsteps behind them was getting closer, and the buildings on either side of the street were closing in, making the space feel tighter, more suffocating. They were almost there, the building where his contact was waiting. Jake could see the door ahead, but it felt like an eternity before they could reach it. "Keep going," Jake said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. He glanced over his shoulder, just for a second. The men chasing them weren't far behind. They were closing the gap fast, and the dark silhouettes of their figures were now just a few paces away. Jake pushed himself harder, his muscles screaming in protest, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not with the girl's safety on the line. They had to make it to the door. They had to find help. When they were just feet away from the entrance, Jake felt a sharp pain in his leg. He ignored it, gritting his teeth against the burn in his muscles. The door was right there, and all they had to do was make it inside. A few more steps. But as they reached the threshold, Jake heard the sound of a gunshot. It rang out in the still night air, so loud it made his ears ring. The girl screamed, and Jake whipped around, his heart dropping in his chest. One of the men had pulled out a gun and fired at them. The bullet hit the ground just inches away from Jake's foot, sending a spray of gravel up into the air. The girl was frozen, her eyes wide with fear. Jake grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the door. "Move," he shouted. She stumbled forward, but her fear was holding her back. Jake shoved her inside, not caring if he was too rough. He slammed the door shut behind them, locking it with a click. For a moment, they stood there, both of them gasping for breath, their hearts racing. Jake's hand was still on the door handle, his body tense, waiting for the sound of footsteps or a gunshot. But there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the building around them. They were inside, and for now, they were safe. But Jake knew it wouldn't last. They were still far from being out of danger. "Are you okay?" he asked, turning to the girl, his voice softer now. She nodded quickly, her face pale. "I'm fine," she whispered, but Jake could see the fear still in her eyes. He could see it in every inch of her body. She was terrified, and he didn't blame her. The world she had known had just shattered in an instant, and now she was caught up in something much bigger than she ever imagined. Jake didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew they couldn't stay here forever. The man they had encountered earlier, the one who had been following them, wasn't going to let them slip away easily. And there was something bigger at play here, something that was tied to the secrets in the box, to the map, and to the girl's grandfather. He needed answers. Jake walked through the building, his boots echoing on the floor. The place was a warehouse of sorts, filled with boxes and old furniture, but the atmosphere felt off. He could sense the danger lurking in the shadows. As they made their way deeper into the building, Jake's mind raced. Who were these men? Why were they after the box? And why did they want the girl's grandfather's secrets so badly? He stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway, his hand hovering over the handle. This was it. The place where his contact was supposed to be. But what if it was too late? What if they had already found him? He pushed the door open cautiously, his senses on high alert. Inside, a man was sitting at a desk, his back to them. He was older, with graying hair and a thick beard, and he wore a leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days. The man didn't turn around at first, but Jake knew him. He had known him for years. The man was one of the few people Jake trusted, a former ally from his past. "You're late," the man said, his voice rough, but not unfriendly. Jake stepped inside, pulling the girl with him. "We've got trouble," Jake said, his voice low. The man turned around then, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Jake and the girl. "I can see that," he said, standing up. "What happened?" Jake told him everything, from the encounter with the man in the orchard to the chase through the city. The man listened without interrupting, his expression hardening as the story unfolded. "So, you've got the box," the man said once Jake finished. "And they're after it." Jake nodded. "And they'll keep coming until they get it." The man looked at the girl, his gaze softening. "And her?" he asked. "She's part of it," Jake said. "Her grandfather hid everything in that box. And now, they're coming for her too." The man sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "All right, we need to get you out of here. Fast. It's not safe anymore." Jake's gut twisted. He had hoped for answers, but now he realized just how deep the rabbit hole went. They had no idea who they were up against. The past was catching up with them, and they were about to be dragged into a battle they weren't prepared for. "I can't believe this is happening," the girl whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear as she looked around at the dark room they had just entered. Jake didn't respond. He was too focused on the task ahead. The man who had helped them escape earlier, the one who had promised them answers, was already moving toward a small desk cluttered with old maps and files. His place was cluttered, but Jake didn't mind. He was used to places like this, places that hid more than they revealed. The man, whose name was Ray, was pulling out papers from a drawer, his face hard with concentration. "You're safe for now," he said without looking up. "But I need to know everything you found. Every piece of that map. Every detail about the box. Time's running out." Jake nodded, pulling the box out of his jacket. He placed it on the desk in front of Ray, watching as the older man's eyes flickered over it. Ray's expression softened for a moment, then hardened again. "You're in deep," he muttered. "The people you're dealing with, they don't mess around. You've opened a door that's going to lead to a lot of trouble." The girl stepped closer, still unsure, but she was curious now. Her eyes flicked back and forth between the two men, unsure of what to ask. Ray picked up a piece of paper, his hands steady despite the tension in the room. "Your grandfather wasn't just hiding things," Ray said slowly, looking up at Jake. "He was protecting you." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight. Ray sighed and sat back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "The secrets in that box, they go deeper than just money or documents. They're about power, control, and people who would kill to keep that power. Your grandfather didn't just disappear, Jake. He was forced into hiding, but he left clues. Clues for you." Jake's mind raced. He had known that the secrets were dangerous, but the way Ray spoke made it clear that it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting a legacy. "And the girl," Ray continued, his gaze shifting to the young girl standing in the corner. "She's part of it. She's the key to everything." The girl looked at Jake, her face filled with confusion. "I don't understand," she whispered. Ray turned his attention to her, his face softening for the first time. "Your grandfather knew that one day, people would come looking for what he hid. and he knew it would be someone from his family who would have to finish what he started. That someone is you. Jake didn't know how to process Ray's words. The girl had been caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. And now, according to Ray, she was the one who held the answers. What do we do now? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ray stood up and walked over to a large map on the wall, pointing at a spot in the middle of nowhere. We go here, he said firmly. This is where it all ends. The place your grandfather was protecting. The place where the secrets are hidden. The girl stepped forward, her eyes locked on the map. What's there? She asked. Ray's expression hardened again. The truth. The answers you're both looking for. But it's also the place where the people who want this information will come for you. We need to move fast. Jake felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were on the verge of uncovering something massive, something that could change everything. But they were also stepping into a world of danger, one that neither he nor the girl could fully understand. How long do we have? Jake asked, his voice steady despite the panic swirling inside him. Ray didn't answer right away. He was looking at the map, his mind clearly elsewhere. Finally, he spoke, his voice grim. Not long. The people who want what's in that box are already on their way. They won't stop until they get it. Jake clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He wasn't going to let anyone harm the girl. He wasn't going to let anyone take what her grandfather had left behind. Then we leave now, Jake said firmly. Ray nodded, walking over to a small closet and pulling out a bag. We need to be prepared, he said. There's no time to waste. The girl watched them, her eyes filled with fear and determination. She was just a kid, but Jake could see that she wasn't about to back down. This was bigger than both of them. It was bigger than anything they had imagined. And there was no turning back now. Let's go, Jake said, his voice full of resolve. He picked up the box, tucked it securely under his arm, and turned to the door. They had a long road ahead of them. But Jake knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened, he was going to protect the girl. He was going to protect the secrets her grandfather had hidden, and he was going to make sure the people who wanted them didn't get away with it. As they walked out of the room and into the cold night, Jake could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. They were heading straight into danger, and there was no way of knowing what would happen next. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. The truth had to be uncovered, and he would do whatever it took to make sure the girl was safe. I know where we're going, Jake said, his voice gruff but steady as he looked at the girl, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. They had just left the safety of Ray's hideout, and now, every step forward was leading them deeper into enemy territory. The cold night air bit at their skin as they moved quickly down the narrow alleyway, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the city. The girl stayed close to him, her small hand clutching the sleeve of his jacket. She had been quiet since their conversation with Ray, her mind clearly processing the weight of everything that had happened. Jake knew she was scared. He could feel her fear, but he also saw something else in her eyes, a quiet resolve. The same resolve he had seen in his own reflection countless times in the mirror. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting the girl and uncovering the truth hidden in the box they carried. They had a long way to go, but Jake wasn't going to let anything stop them. They couldn't afford to slow down now. They reached the end of the alley and turned onto a wider street, the city's lights casting long shadows across the pavement. Jake glanced around, his senses on. High alert. They were still being followed, he was sure of it. The footsteps from earlier were gone, but Jake could feel the eyes of their pursuers on them. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there, waiting for the right moment to strike. The city was full of shadows, and there were people in those shadows who would stop at nothing to get what was in the box. Keep your head down, Jake whispered to the girl, his voice barely audible over the noise of the city. We're almost there. The girl nodded, her eyes darting around nervously, but she didn't say anything. Jake didn't expect her to. She was still processing everything. They kept walking, moving quickly but carefully, their pace never faltering. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the building Ray had pointed to. It was an old, run-down structure, its windows dark and its door locked. But Jake didn't hesitate. He knew what they had to do. He pulled the girl closer, shielding her from any potential threats, and reached into his pocket for the key Ray had given him. The key was old, tarnished, and heavy, and it fit the door's lock with a satisfying click. The door creaked open, and Jake motioned for the girl to go inside first. She hesitated for just a moment. then stepped through the door, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond. Jake followed her inside, closing the door quietly behind him. The room they entered was small, dimly lit, and smelled of dust and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old boxes, papers, and files. It was a storage room of sorts, the kind of place where people kept things they didn't want anyone else to find. Jake closed the door behind them and locked it, then turned to the girl. "We're safe for now," he said, his voice low. The girl nodded but didn't speak. She was looking around the room, her eyes wide with curiosity. Jake didn't have time to explain everything, but he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stay here long. The building may have been safe for now, but it wasn't going to stay that way for long. "We need to find Ray," Jake said, his voice urgent. "He'll have answers. He'll know what to do next." The girl looked up at him, her expression filled with uncertainty. "And after that?" she asked quietly. Jake didn't answer right away. What would happen after they found Ray? Would the answers they were looking for be enough to keep them safe? Or would they just lead them deeper into danger? He didn't know, but he wasn't about to stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. "We'll figure it out," Jake said finally. "But for now, we need to stay focused. Ray is our best chance." The girl nodded again, though her eyes still held that flicker of doubt. She was scared. She had every right to be. But Jake knew one thing. He would protect her, no matter what. He would see this through to the end. And no matter how dark it got, they would make it out alive. Together. "I know this place," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and fear. They had just entered a small, dimly lit room, and the air was thick with the smell of old books and dust. Jake's hand rested on the box he had been carrying, his fingers tightening around it. He had hoped for answers, but what he was about to find might be more than either of them were prepared for. "Stay close," Jake added, glancing around. The room was filled with old furniture, stacked boxes, and strange trinkets. It wasn't much different from any other storage space in the city, but Jake knew better. This was Ray's hideout. Ray had always been the type of man who kept secrets close, buried in places no one would ever think to look. And now, Jake and the girl were deep in the heart of it, with no way of knowing what they would find next. The girl moved closer to Jake, her steps hesitant but determined. She had been quiet since they had entered the building, her eyes darting from one shadowy corner to the next. Jake could tell she was scared. This world was too big for her to understand. And yet, here she was, pulled into something much larger than herself. Jake couldn't protect her from the truth, but he could protect her from the people who wanted to use that truth for their own gain. "Ray will be here soon," Jake muttered, more to himself than to the girl. His mind was racing. The people who had been following them weren't going to give up. They were too close, too eager to get their hands on whatever secrets were hidden in that box. He needed to get to Ray before they did. But even if they found Ray, would he be able to help? What did Ray even know about the box? Jake wasn't sure, but Ray was their best chance. They had no other choice. The sound of footsteps echoed through the building, interrupting Jake's thoughts. He tensed, his hand going instinctively to his knife. The girl looked up at him, her face pale. She could hear the footsteps too. Jake motioned for her to stay still, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The footsteps grew louder, and then the door creaked open. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he turned, his hand ready. But it wasn't Ray who entered the room. It was a man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure dressed in a long black coat. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but Jake could make out the glint of a gun at his side. The man stepped into the room, his eyes immediately locking onto Jake and the girl. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the man said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "You're not going to find what you're looking for here." Jake didn't move, his eyes narrowing. He had seen men like this before, cold, calculating, and not afraid to get their hands dirty. He wasn't sure how this man had found them, but he knew one thing for sure. The man wasn't here to help. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. The man smiled, a slow, almost predatory grin. "Let's just say I'm someone who's been keeping an eye on you. You're digging too deep, Jake." The girl stepped back, her hand trembling as she clutched the hem of her jacket. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, but he didn't let it show on his face. He couldn't afford to. "I don't know who you are, but you're in the wrong place," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. The man's grin faded, and his eyes hardened. You don't understand, he said, taking a step forward. This isn't about you. It's about what's in that box. Jake's pulse quickened. The man knew about the box. He knew everything. Jake didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he pulled the knife from its sheath, his fingers tight around the handle. The man's eyes flicked to the blade, and for a moment, Jake saw a flicker of hesitation. But it was gone in an instant. The man drew his gun, aiming it directly at Jake. Put the knife down, he said, his voice steady. You won't win this. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't afraid of the gun. He wasn't afraid of the man. He was afraid of what would happen to the girl if he didn't fight back. I'm not going to let you take it, Jake said, his voice filled with resolve. The man's lips curled into a smirk. You don't have a choice. He pulled the trigger. But Jake was faster. He lunged forward, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. The bullet missed, narrowly grazing his shoulder as he collided with the man. They tumbled to the floor in a heap, struggling for control. Jake's knife found its mark, slashing through the man's coat and drawing blood. The man grunted in pain but didn't relent. He kicked Jake off, knocking the knife from his hand. But Jake wasn't finished. He grabbed the man by the throat, his grip tightening as he forced the man back against the wall. You're not getting away with this, Jake growled. The man gasped for breath, his hands clawing at Jake's arms. You don't know what you're dealing with, he wheezed. You're in over your head. Jake's eyes burned with anger. He didn't care about the man's threats. He only cared about keeping the girl safe. He shoved the man back, sending him crashing to the ground. The man lay there for a moment, panting, before he slowly started to rise. Jake didn't give him the chance. He kicked the gun out of the man's reach, pinning him down. You're not going anywhere, Jake said, his voice cold. He turned to the girl, who was still standing in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. Stay back, he ordered, his voice low but firm. The girl nodded, not saying a word. Jake turned back to the man, who was now on his knees. Who are you working for? Jake demanded. The man didn't answer. Instead, he looked up at Jake, with defiance in his eyes. You'll find out soon enough, he said with a grin. But it'll be too late by then. Jake knew the man wasn't lying. They were running out of time. But at least for now, they had the upper hand. The man's defiant grin faded as Jake tightened his grip on his throat, his pulse quickening with the realization of how close they were to the truth. Who do you work for? Jake demanded again, his voice colder this time, filled with an intensity that brooked no hesitation. The man's eyes flickered to the girl standing nervously in the corner, and then back at Jake. You won't survive this, the man muttered, his words barely audible, but filled with enough menace to make the air around them feel even heavier. Jake leaned in closer, his face inches from the man's, his voice dangerously calm. I've survived worse. But I'm not going to waste time with you unless you start talking. Who's pulling your strings? The man didn't answer at first, instead looking at Jake with that same defiant look. But Jake wasn't about to let him off the hook. The people who were after them weren't just interested in a box. They were interested in something much bigger, something that could ruin them if they didn't get the answers. The tension in the room was palpable, and the girl, standing in the shadows, was beginning to realize just how deep she was in. Jake could feel the weight of it all, the responsibility of keeping her safe, the secrets buried deep in the box, the danger closing in. If they didn't get to the bottom of this, they would be swallowed up by the storm. The man coughed, trying to gather some strength, but Jake didn't release his grip. Tell me, Jake growled. Who do you work for? Finally, the man's resistance began to falter. He glanced around the room as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The walls were closing in. He looked at the girl again, his gaze flicking between her and Jake. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he said, his voice strained. But you will. Soon enough. Jake's patience was wearing thin, but he could tell the man was on the verge of breaking. He didn't want to waste any more time. I'm asking you one last time, Jake said, his grip tightening ever so slightly. Tell me who's behind this. The man finally let out a deep breath, as if he had been holding it for far too long. You don't want to know? He said, almost pleading. You'll be dead before you get a chance to use that box. Jake's grip loosened for a second, a flash of confusion crossing his mind. He leaned back slightly, watching the man, trying to process what he'd just said. What do you mean? Jake asked. The man smirked weakly, his voice trembling now. There's a bigger game at play, something much older than you can imagine. People with more power than you'll ever understand. They don't care about the box, Jake. They care about you. And her, he said, nodding toward the girl, who flinched at the mention of her involvement. She's the key to it all. Your grandfather was just a small piece of the puzzle. You're in the middle of a war that has nothing to do with you, but they're going to drag you into it. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. His mind raced as the implications of the man's words began to sink in. Who are they? Jake demanded, trying to keep the fear from his voice. The man just shook his head, his eyes distant, as if he was seeing something that Jake couldn't. You'll find out soon enough. But by then, it'll be too late. Jake's fists clenched, and the urge to shake the man for more answers burned through him. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't let them be dragged into a war they didn't understand. He needed answers. He needed to know what was coming and how to stop it. Tell me where to go, Jake said, his voice firm, his patience running out. I'm not leaving here without answers. The man's eyes flashed with something, resignation, maybe fear, and then he spoke again, his voice quiet but urgent. You want answers? Follow the map. It leads to the old warehouse by the docks. But don't trust anyone there. And don't bring anyone with you. They'll be waiting. They always are. Jake's heart raced. The docks. It made sense now. The location his grandfather had hidden, the secrets buried beneath layers of lies. The map had led them here, but there was so much more. Who's waiting? Jake asked, his voice low. The man didn't answer. Instead, he closed his eyes, as if preparing for the inevitable. The silence in the room was deafening. For a moment, Jake considered whether he should end it here, stop this man from ever hurting anyone again. But he didn't. He needed the information. He needed to know what was coming. You better not be lying, Jake said, his voice a growl. The man didn't respond. He was already slipping into unconsciousness, the last of his energy drained by the confrontation. Jake stood, stepping away from the man, and turned to the girl. She was still standing in the corner, her face pale, her body tense. You okay? He asked. She nodded slowly, though Jake could see the fear still in her eyes. What's happening? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Jake admitted, his voice heavy. But we need to go to the docks. We have to finish this. He turned and headed for the door, the girl following closely behind. The world outside had grown darker, and Jake knew that they were heading into a storm, one that would change everything. But there was no turning back now. They had to see this through, no matter the cost. The docks were dark, the kind of place where shadows clung to the walls and the faint smell of salt water and rust lingered in the air. Jake could hear the distant hum of industrial machines, the low sound of a ship's horn, and the soft crash of waves against the wooden pier. It was the perfect place to hide, the perfect place for secrets to be buried. But tonight, those secrets were about to be uncovered. He could feel the girl behind him, her presence a reminder of how much was at stake. She had been quiet since they left the safe house, her mind still processing the weight of everything. Jake didn't blame her. She had been thrown into a world she didn't understand, and now there was no turning back. They had to find out what was in that box, and they had to do it quickly. The man's warning about what was waiting for them had echoed in Jake's mind since they left the hideout. But even now, as they approached the docks, he wasn't sure what they were about to face. He didn't like being uncertain, but there was no time for second-guessing. They needed to find Ray, get the answers they needed, and get out. The buildings around them loomed like silent sentinels, casting long shadows across the water. Jake's senses were on high alert as they walked down the narrow path between the warehouse and the water's edge. Every creak, every sound, made him tense. They were getting closer. The map Ray had given him was etched in his mind, and the coordinates led them to a large, abandoned warehouse near the end of the dock. It looked forgotten, the kind of place people would only visit if they had no other choice. But Jake knew better. This place was important, and whatever secrets lay hidden inside were about to come to light. As they neared the door of the warehouse, Jake motioned for the girl to stay behind him. He didn't want to risk anything happening to her. She nodded, her expression serious, though the fear was still there. Jake didn't want her to be scared, but there was nothing he could do to protect her from the danger they were about to face. They had no idea who was waiting for them inside. The door to the warehouse was old and rusted, its hinges groaning as Jake pushed it open. Inside, the space was vast, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. Broken crates and piles of debris were scattered across the floor. Jake stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. He could hear nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the distant echo of footsteps somewhere deeper in the building. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice low. The girl stayed by his side, her eyes darting around nervously. She was scared, and Jake couldn't blame her. They were walking into a trap, and he knew it. But they didn't have a choice. They had to keep moving forward. "Ray's waiting," Jake muttered, trying to steady his nerves. He had to focus. This wasn't just about the box anymore. It was about survival, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from them. They moved deeper into the warehouse, the air growing colder as they passed row after row of abandoned machinery. The silence was almost deafening, and Jake's instincts told him something was wrong. He had learned long ago to trust his gut. As they approached the back of the building, Jake's eyes locked onto a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was Ray, but something was off. Ray wasn't alone. A group of men stood behind him, their faces hidden in the shadows. They looked like they were waiting for something, waiting for Jake, waiting for the girl. "Ray," Jake called, his voice tense. Ray turned to face him, a grim look on his face. "You're here," Ray said quietly, "but I'm afraid it's too late." Before Jake could respond, the men behind Ray stepped forward, their intentions clear. They were armed. The girl's grip on Jake's arm tightened, and he could feel her trembling. He didn't want her to be scared, but he couldn't promise her safety. Not yet. The men moved closer, surrounding them in the cold, dim light. Jake's mind raced, trying to figure out their next move. "You don't have to do this," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "We don't have time to play games, Jake," Ray replied, his voice colder than Jake had ever heard it. "The people behind all of this, are already on their way. You're not leaving here with the box." Jake's grip on the knife at his side tightened. He wasn't leaving without a fight, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let them take the girl. But even as the tension built, Jake knew he couldn't take them all on by himself. He needed a plan. He needed a way out. "You don't have to get involved in this," Jake said, trying one last time to reach Ray. Ray's eyes narrowed, and his expression hardened. "It's already too late for that," he said quietly. Jake wasn't sure what that meant, but he knew Ray wasn't the man he once was. Something had changed, and now, the past was catching up to them all. The air around them crackled with tension as the men moved in, their eyes locked on Jake and the girl. "We don't have to do this," Jake repeated, his voice colder now, his hand tightening on the knife. But Ray only shook his head. "I'm sorry, Jake," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is the only way." With a sudden motion, one of the men lunged toward Jake, and everything went dark. The moment the man lunged at Jake, everything seemed to slow down. His hand shot out to grab Jake's arm, but Jake was faster. His instincts kicked in, and he sidestepped just as the man's arm reached for him, sending him stumbling forward. Without hesitation, Jake pulled out his knife, the blade gleaming in the low light of the warehouse. The man regained his balance and came at him again, this time more aggressively, but Jake was ready. He ducked under the man's wild swing, his heart racing as adrenaline surged through him. The girl was still standing behind him, frozen with fear. Jake knew he couldn't let this drag on. He had to end it quickly. The other men were still standing behind Ray, not moving, but watching with cold, calculating eyes. Jake wasn't sure if they were waiting for the fight to escalate or if they had their own agenda. But he couldn't focus on them now. The man who had attacked him was his immediate threat. Jake stepped forward, his knife flashing in the dim light as he thrust it toward the man's side. The man grunted in pain, his hand flying to his wound, but Jake didn't hesitate. He wasn't about to let anyone hurt the girl. He twisted the knife, forcing the man to step back, his face contorted in pain. But before he could finish the job, another figure emerged from the shadows, lunging at Jake. Jake barely had time to react as the man's fists collided with his chest, knocking the wind out of him. He stumbled backward, but managed to regain his footing. The girl cried out from behind him, and that was enough to ignite Jake's fury. He couldn't let them get to her. He pushed the man away and spun, his knee driving into the man's stomach. The man gasped, stumbling back as Jake took another step toward him, the knife still in hand. Ray's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "That's enough," he shouted, his tone carrying an authority Jake hadn't expected. "Stop." Jake froze, his hand still clenched around the knife, his breath coming in heavy gasps. He looked over at Ray, who was standing just a few feet away, watching him intently. The other men stood silent, their eyes flicking between Jake and Ray. "You don't understand," Ray said, his voice calmer now, but still heavy with tension. "They're not our enemies." Jake's mind raced as he processed Ray's words. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The men who had just attacked him weren't enemies? He was confused, but his instincts told him to listen. Ray stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "They're here to help," he said. "We're all after the same thing." Jake lowered the knife slowly, his eyes never leaving the men. He didn't trust them. Not yet. Ray seemed to notice his hesitation. "They're not here to kill you, Jake," he said, his voice steady. "They're here to protect you. To protect her." Jake turned to look at the girl, who was still standing behind him, her face pale and her eyes wide with confusion. "Protect her from what?" Jake demanded. Ray looked back at the men, then to Jake. "From the people who want what's in that box," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "We're not the only ones who are looking for it. There are others. People who will stop at nothing to get their hands on it." Jake swallowed hard, the weight of Ray's words settling in. He had always known the secrets in the box were dangerous, but he hadn't realized just how dangerous until now. He glanced over at the men who had been standing silent behind Ray. They didn't look like the type of people who would help, but something about Ray's expression made him hesitate. "Who are they?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ray nodded toward the men. "This is Caleb," he said, pointing to the tall man with dark, shaggy hair. "And this is Ben," he said, indicating a shorter man with a scar across his cheek. "They've been tracking the people who've been after you. And now, they're helping us find out what's really going on." Jake's grip on the knife loosened as he absorbed Ray's words. "What do you mean by really going on?" he asked, his voice cautious. Ray's expression darkened. "There's more to this than just your grandfather's secrets," he said. "Your grandfather wasn't just some old man hiding treasure. He was part of something much bigger. And whatever's in that box, whatever it is, it's tied to a lot of people. Dangerous people." The weight of Ray's words hit Jake harder than anything else. His grandfather hadn't just been a man with a hidden fortune, he had been involved in something far more dangerous. Jake turned to Caleb and Ben, his eyes searching for any sign of deception. "So what now?" he asked. Caleb spoke for the first time, his voice gruff, but steady. "Now we get the truth. We find out who's been pulling the strings, and we make sure the girl stays safe." Jake looked at the girl, her face still pale, but now filled with a mix of fear and resolve. "You're not safe yet," Jake said to her softly. She nodded, as if she understood the gravity of the situation. The man who had attacked them wasn't the only threat. There were others, lurking in the shadows, and Jake knew they had to keep moving. He wasn't about to let them fall into their hands. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice firm. "We need to finish this." Ray gave him a small nod, signaling the others to move. The group made their way deeper into the warehouse, Jake's mind already racing ahead, planning their next steps. The truth was out there, but the closer they got to it, the more dangerous it became. They had no idea what they were up against. But Jake was sure of one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone take the girl. Not without a fight. They were getting closer to the truth, but with each step, the danger grew more palpable. Jake could feel the tension in the air as they moved through the dark, abandoned warehouse. The group of men, Caleb, Ben, and Ray, moved silently behind him, all focused on the task ahead. The girl, once again close to Jake, had gone silent, her fears settling in as she realized that there was no turning back now. They were too deep into this to stop. As they neared the back of the warehouse, Jake's eyes scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement, any hint of an ambush. But everything was quiet, too quiet. His instincts screamed at him to be ready. Ray stopped suddenly, his hand held up in a signal to stop. Jake looked around, his mind calculating, trying to understand what Ray had sensed. Ray turned to him, his face grim. "They're here," he said softly, his voice low. "We've been followed." Jake's grip tightened on the box, his eyes darting to the door. There was no escape now. They had no choice but to confront whoever was waiting for them. The girl took a deep breath beside him, her body stiff with fear, but her resolve unbroken. Jake nodded to her, his voice soft but steady. "Stay close. We don't move unless I say so." She nodded, her eyes never leaving him. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, slow and deliberate. It wasn't just one person. There were at least 3, maybe more. Jake motioned for everyone to hide behind the large crates stacked against the wall. He didn't want to give away their position just yet. As they crouched, the footsteps grew louder, closer. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. He wasn't sure who they were up against, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. The first figure appeared from the shadows, a tall man in a dark coat. His face was partially obscured, but Jake could make out the unmistakable glint of a weapon. He wasn't alone. Behind him, 2 other men appeared, all of them armed. The girl gasped quietly behind Jake, but he silenced her with a hand on her arm. They had to wait for the right moment. The leader, the tall man, stopped in the middle of the room, scanning the space with cold, calculating eyes. "I know you're here," he called out, his voice carrying in the stillness. "You've been running long enough. It's time to stop." Jake felt his pulse quicken. These weren't just random thugs. These were the people who had been hunting them. The man's words confirmed it. They had been followed from the moment they stepped out of Ray's hideout. But Jake wasn't about to back down now. He had come too far. "If you want to live, I suggest you come out now," the man said, his voice smooth and menacing. Jake's mind raced, weighing their options. He couldn't just rush out and attack. They needed a plan. They needed to be smarter than this. He turned to Ray, who was crouching low beside him. "Do you know who they are?" Jake whispered. Ray's eyes were narrowed, focused. "I've seen them before. They work for someone bigger. Someone who wants that box badly enough to kill for it." Jake's jaw clenched. They were playing with fire, and he knew it. But they had no choice. He looked at the girl one last time. Her face was pale, but there was a steely resolve in her eyes. She wasn't afraid to face whatever was coming. "We're going out there," Jake said quietly. "Stay close to me." The girl nodded, and with one final glance at the others, Jake stood up, his knife in hand. He didn't know if they could win this fight, but he wasn't going down without a battle. As they moved into the open, the 3 men turned to face them, their eyes cold and calculating. The tall man in the front smiled darkly, his grip tightening on the gun he held. "I told you to stop running," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now, you're going to pay the price." Jake didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, moving with speed and precision. The first man raised his gun, but Jake was already too close. He slammed into him, knocking the weapon out of his hand and sending him sprawling to the ground. The other 2 men hesitated for a moment, but Jake didn't give them the chance to recover. He swept one of them off his feet with a low kick and then turned to face the final man, who had pulled a knife from his belt. The 2 of them circled each other, the tension thick in the air. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest, but his focus was razor sharp. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The man lunged at him, slashing with the knife, but Jake blocked it, his own knife moving in quick, calculated strikes. The man was fast, but Jake was faster. With one swift motion, he disarmed the man, sending the knife skidding across the floor. He didn't stop there. He followed through, delivering a final blow that knocked the man to the ground. The fight was over, but Jake knew it wasn't the end. There were more out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Jake turned to Ray, his voice low. "We need to move. Now." The girl stepped forward, her face filled with determination. "Where do we go next?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Jake looked at her, his expression hardening. "We go to the docks. It's the only place we can go now." They had no other choice. The path ahead was dangerous, but Jake wasn't about to let anyone take the girl. He wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth, no matter the cost.